I will begin with framework and then move on to the two main voting issues. So you've heard a lot of the different definitions throughout the round, and the negative would like you to believe that the word should, as they say it with more and more emphasis, it could really mean could instead. But remember that we actually provide you the only definition in the round of should, coming from the Oxford American Dictionary, which defines should as probable. And because of this, you have to be voting on our two main criteria that we already presented to you, immediacy and practicality. Because if these two criteria still aren't met, then an urgent and coherent response simply isn't possible. Furthermore, they describe urgency in the sense that it should be the most sustainable. However, when we're looking at sustainability, we should look at the sustainability of the human race in an immediate or pressing sense. And in that ideal, the criterion of immediacy will automatically flow to the affirmative side because people are being effective now. Let's move on to our two criteria. First, we'll begin with the criteria of immediacy. We point out to you that adaptation is the most immediate response. My opponents would like to argue that there's a 40-year time frame for mitigation efforts to be successful. However, with this statement alone, you vote for the affirmative side, because 40 years is an excessive amount of time which we don't actually have any sort of urgent or pressing need to mitigate within the status quo. Instead, we need to adapt now and engender the technologies that will make it more feasible in the future and more politically approachable. Also, they never responded to our piece of evidence from Catherine Solomon, who explains that emissions will take 1,000 years to ultimately cool even after the final emission is actually excreted. And because of this, it seems pretty evident that no matter what we do now, there's a significant amount of climate change that still is irreversible and is going to be locked in. Thus, adaptation provides for the immediate and effective response. The opponents would also like to argue that civil wars and ethnic conflicts and migrations will be forced and rampant throughout the entire world. But since adaptation focuses on being sustainable in the sense that we preserve the resources that force these individuals to migrate, we can effectively change the crops and produce an effective supply of water so that they don't have to change anywhere away from their milieus, but instead stay in the areas that they're already going. So migration really isn't an issue because we can actually adapt to the lack of resources. Finally, because we actually protect these resources now and save the individuals' lives, we can actually solve this problem in a more immediate and pressing response. The opponents also like to hinge a lot of the fact that coral reefs sustain 500 million people, but remember that they don't address our evidence, which indicates that no matter what we do, even with an urgent and aggressive mitigation strategy, the coral reefs are doomed to extinction. So unfortunately for the coral reefs, it seems that no matter what we do, nothing will help. But instead, adaptation will affect lives now. The second main criteria is the issue of practicality, which is a huge voting issue in the debate. We're not adapting forever, or we're not going to be adapting forever, which is a real issue that I want to stress, that we're not going to be adapting up to a 4 degrees Celsius range, but instead be focusing on mitigation once it becomes viable within the status quo. And also, this leads us to understand that within the status quo, it isn't viable for a couple different reasons. First, we have the issue of the issue of international support. They like to talk a lot about international cap and trade agreements in places like Australia, the European Union, and even Japan and China. But remember that China hasn't actually implemented it yet, and Japan actually postponed it for a later year, citing economic interests at stake. And because of this, international stakeholders will ultimately prioritize their economic interests over any sort of global initiative instead. China and India are already building 1,000 new coal power plants, which makes it impractical within the status quo. The second issue is the issue of gridlock. They say that migration is unpopular, but we won't need to migrate if we preserve the resources now. Instead, we should focus on that immediate response so that we save these lives within the status quo. Also, the issue of technology remains unresponded to. They argue about sequestration, but as a lot of the judges pointed out, sequestration is deeply flawed and can actually leak and isn't a real permanent solution. And because of this, the technology simply isn't there. They even admit that it will be viable only by 2020. Also, adaptation has benefits that are unanswered within the round. We give you the benefits of a tailored response and development and technology, which all lead us to believe that by giving money to these developing nations currently, we can have the benefit of not only tailoring the policy to them, but also being able to develop them and boost their adaptive capacity within the current climate change framework. And because Chase has already mentioned that $516 billion was pledged at the Rio Plus 20 conference, this is evident that funding exists, and these developed or developing countries will soon become developed, but only if we institute an effective response to climate change. So the negative is attempting to find some sort of mitigative plug to fill up the ever-expanding hole, but it seems that after 16 years of international agreement, that ship has sailed. Instead, we should focus on a solution that will float the boat and save the lives now. I urge you to vote for the affirmative side and lives. Thank you very much for your time.